here we are.
Again?
Do we need a name for this thing?
For what?
Because we got the angry moderate is like, what I'm talking about, the issues. But then this is the more casual, sit down, conversational version of the angry moderate. So that we got to have a newer, better name.
How about the talking angry moderate?
Okay.
We need a host. Who could be the host? From like the Talking Dead.
Yeah, we need a host. The Talking Dead.
Unpacking. No, I don't know what to call it.
Well, maybe
after party.
Yeah. Yeah, that's pretty good. So this week, as most of you know, the Senate acquitted Trump on both impeachment charges, and the thing that I talked about this week, the title of the thing was Conservatism at the Crossroads, but really it's more about, and honestly, as a moderate, I care less about the fact, I don't really care that much about the fact that he was acquitted, because that was expected. I don't think anybody really expected he was going to be convicted on the articles, so that's not really a big thing. My big thing is why.
Well, not because of the value plus or minus of the articles, but because of the obvious fact that the Senate was not going to convict him because they were majority Republican.
Right, exactly.
So,
and it takes, 67 votes to convict, and there's no way, we all knew there's no way.
Yeah, you would have had to have like a third or...
Right, you would have had to have, close to 20 Republicans switching votes, and that's not going to happen. So, but my big issue is the rationale that the Senate used for acquitting, and that to me is far more problematic. Anyway, that's what we're going to discuss today. We're going to watch the video. Maybe. Do you have any preliminary thoughts or ideas?
Well, just to clarify, one of the rationales that was presented by Trump's representation is what we're debating here.
Correct.
We don't have like a record to show whether all the Senate agreed with that rationale that he presented or not.
We don't, other than we kind of do.
They came to the same conclusion to vote against it. Their reasons were not, they didn't check a box on what their reason was when they voted to acquit.
Well, but they pretty much did when they decided not to hear from witnesses. And then when they decided not to get evidence.
Well,
they were saying...
or maybe they just didn't want to hear the evidence, because then they'd have to really consider whether to convict or not. The less evidence you have, the less...
We all know they weren't going to convict, but in fact, there were both Senate and House Republicans that said that the House made its case that he did what he's accused of doing, but it's simply not a crime.
Right.
So there's no point in getting more evidence and talking to witnesses, because even if they corroborate everything you're saying, it's not a crime.
Right.
That was the main impetus.
Our main concern, and I think the main thing you're addressing here, is, like you said, not about whether he was acquitted or should have been acquitted, but if anybody believes this thing that Dershowitz said, and if that gets enshrined as precedent, that is problematic. So let's listen to it.
Okay. In the Midwest, to parents that were as religious as they were politically conservative. I lived in a part of the country that was overwhelmingly red. That history informed my favorable view toward classic Edmund Burke-style conservatism, whose ideas are important to preserve and transmit to future generations. The bedrock ideas of conservatism, that institutions arrange themselves through experience, meaning that society is a vast and complex organism where changes happen organically, and no one person, or even a group, can wipe out a society's institutions and replace them with anything remotely comparable. So the only acceptable mode of political change is organic, not revolutionary, because each generation must realize they are the caretakers of society's assets, not the owners. Further, it's not intellectual brilliance that is called for in government, but rather a sound understanding of people, steadiness of character, and common sense with a dash of flair. And I think Trump has all three of these. These ideas have historically been adopted by conservatives, so by extension, conservatives generally hold, number one, affection and respect for social reality and the past from which it has developed. Two, a cautious attitude to change and a desire to see that change happens gradually. Number three, accepting the mixed motives of humans and a disbelief in their perfectibility. And number four, a deep and abiding respect for the rule of law.
So just to note, you're talking about classic conservatism, and you're talking about the pillars of conservatism, but keeping in mind that the current Republican Party, to a large degree, claims conservatism, but doesn't seem to be demonstrating that with the actions and things that they're.
Agreed. So when I say I agree with conservative principles,
we're not saying like here's all the pristine beliefs of the Republican Party, and that's what's motivating all their actions. We're just talking about that classical conservatism. What is it?
Right.
I believe in these things, but now, as it initially appeared that possible witnesses would be called to corroborate the charge that President Trump withheld aid from Ukraine in order to secure a political advantage for the purpose of his re-election, the defense switched tactics to make the outrageous claim that that is okay, that if a president merely believes that his re-election is in the best interest of the country, he is entitled to engage in any activity that will help him achieve that goal. So says defense attorney Alan Dershowitz. Did he really say that?
Every public official that I know believes that his election is in the public interest. And mostly you're right. Your election is in the public interest. And if a president does something which he believes will help him get elected in the public interest, that cannot be the kind of quid pro quo that results in impeachment.
Now, to me, that is the most dangerous thinking that there is. I can't imagine.
Taken at its face, if I'd like to see him in a written form defend that statement, because if he's kind of spitballing and seeing where will he go with this, that's insane. The idea that if the president is doing something to get elected, that he can't be impeached for it. But I think that you could take that statement say if you tried to steelman that position, which we like to do when we're arguing with people, you could say that just because something will promote his reelection, that doesn't necessarily mean he's doing it for criminal reasons. For example, in this case, I think originally it seemed to matter to people where they were saying, what, he's asking for this this quid pro quo, which, by the way, quid pro quo is what politics is. By itself, it's not. It doesn't mean something is being done wrong. It just means we're compromising, we're trading off something. I give you something, you give me something. That's basically how politics works most of the time. But in this case, we're saying it was a quid pro quo asking for something inappropriate or possibly illegal in exchange for something that that Ukraine wanted. But the point being that if just the very fact that Trump said investigate Biden, and just because that might potentially help his election, doesn't make that thing wrong. Because the executive is supposed to investigate corruption if they believe it to occur. The question that comes back to is, what was Trump's motivation in asking for that investigation? And I think his motivation, most of us have a very, it seems like a slight majority of America even has the belief that he was inappropriately asking for something in exchange, for the aid. But the question of, was what he was asking for inappropriate? Investigating some possible corruption in and of itself is not necessarily a basis for
asking
impeachment.
for an investigation in and of itself isn't wrong, but you have to look at the broader context.
The motive.
He only has ever asked for investigations about political rivals and Hillary Clinton, and he's asking Russia for her emails, and now he's talking to Ukraine about investigating Biden. So he has created a behavioral pattern where he is not a law and order type president, where he really is deeply concerned with the law, because he isn't.
Well, he's not. You're not seeing any discussions that would indicate that he was. It seems to be just this case.
And a point that you brought up that I'm gonna steal.
You can't steal my point.
I'm gonna steal your point. Take credit for it. You brought up the point the other day when we were talking about this off camera, because all the best discussions are off camera. So this is the horrible.
This is the crappy version.
This is the crappy version of our conversation. But you brought up the point that a good indicator that he was not, in fact, looking to uncover corruption was in the fact that he told Ukraine that he wanted them to announce an investigation. Okay, not that they should investigate, but they should announce it, because it's, for him, it's all about the optics of it, and it's all about how it looks. And if he can smear Biden for something, then all the better. Secondly, if he was genuinely interested in finding out if there was any corruption, I don't know how many of you know about how law enforcement investigations take place, but do you know how many times a successful investigation announces itself?
Starts with the announcement.
Starts with the announcement that we're going to investigate so-and-so? The number is 0.
Hey, listen, I'd like to announce that we're investigating the Gambino crime family. We're going to be really looking into that. And no, it clearly, and this is funny because all of the quotes that I've heard, and I haven't listened end to end to all the conversations, but all the quotes that I've heard and all the excerpts of texts and written notes and things all seem to be focused on announcing the investigation, which is the opposite of what I think you would want to do if you were actually trying to get to the bottom of some thorny issue.
Right. Agreed.
And so that's why I think the motive is more important than the statement, right? And I think that there should have been more witnesses, or ideally, in order to prove the motive, you'd need to have witnesses who could speak to the motive. And in the act of refusing to answer the subpoenas, or telling his staff to refuse to answer the subpoenas, he prevented us from seeing any more behind the scenes discussions that, say Trump was back there saying, I need you to dig up some dirt on Biden. Well, he never said that in any of the excerpts that we heard. All he ever said was, announce an investigation into Biden. I suppose somewhere he said investigate Biden and announce the investigation.
Right, you have to assume somewhere he did say investigate.
But yeah, so my point is that I don't think that the evidence that was presented speaks definitively to his motive. It seems obvious what his motive is, that it had to do with his reelection, but in stonewalling all those witnesses, we didn't. I don't feel like we got that to be actually on the record of him actually saying that, and that's what I think would have perhaps convinced more people to impeach. I'm not sure how much of what Dershowitz said here actually affected their decision. I just want to make sure that idea that, well, if he's in good, really just trying to do whatever he can to get reelected, well, obviously Nixon was impeached for that exact thing, right?
Well, here's the thing, though. You're saying you don't know how much Dershowitz affected them. If you remember, at the time he made that speech, there was still some debate as to whether the Republicans had enough votes to stop witnesses from being called. Yeah. Because Murkowski and Collins and
that was all optics too, pretending like they were judiciously thinking about it. They were all in blue states, and they want to make sure that.
But I do know that both sides seem to be unsure as to how the final count would go. So because it was possible that the Senate would end up calling witnesses,
right, for the witness
particularly
part.
like Bolton.
Just to be clear, whether or not to call witnesses was in question. We never doubted that he was going to be acquitted.
Oh, no, he was going to be acquitted.
Because basically that's what the Senate said going into the whole thing is, let's get this acquittal done.
Right. But we didn't know whether they're going to be witnesses.
Right.
Therefore, as a preemptive defense, they trotted Dershowitz out to say, because considering that witnesses may be called, look, even when witnesses come, and even if they corroborate this, doesn't matter, there's no crime.
Right.
So they were already loading that up. And then, of course, when they ended up getting enough votes to shit can the witnesses and any other papers and evidence, then they reverted to, well, they didn't make their case. Well, of course they didn't make their case because we don't have anybody to talk to.
Right. So if I would not be able to argue as much against that statement by the Senate saying the House should have made the case and failed to make their case. They couldn't make any case completely without getting the witnesses they requested.
Right.
Now, I would have been fine with the executive, the president, saying, listen, this is a witch hunt. You're not going to derail my whole administration with a bunch of frivolous witnesses. I'll give you 10 witnesses for 10 hours each, and that's it. Right. If he had said that, or if he said, we'll give you excerpts from the text, but I'll give it to you in a month. I'm not giving it to you next week. I'm not derailing my administration with this witch hunt. I would have, even though I'm not a Trump supporter, I would have been able to see the logic and the justice in that, because there was no doubt from the very beginning that the Democrats, before he was even elected, they started saying, "How are we going to impeach this guy? We got to figure out how to impeach this guy." It was a very popular thing as soon as the election ended. So it was a foregone conclusion they were going to try to impeach him. Of course, he walked into it by giving them some really questionable stuff, right? And I think, like I said, on the surface of it, it seems obvious that he was doing this for election reasons. But in refusing to give the witnesses, I think that he walked into a further charge of obstruction of Congress, and that being one of the articles of impeachment, I think is actually the more serious article of impeachment, because the abuse of power is dependent on what was his motive in calling for the investigation, right?
Right.
But the refusal to provide any of the witnesses that were subpoenaed by Congress, if any other president just refused to give the evidence, that would not have been allowed. In fact, I mean, jump back to Bill Clinton. He gave all the evidence. In fact, he didn't put any limits on it, basically. What do you want? We'll give you anything, that everybody
he turned over all the documents and witnesses that Congress asked for.
And they spent years looking for the thing, and they weren't able to put together a strong enough case. And again, I'm not saying I'm a big admirer of Bill Clinton or Hillary Clinton either. But the point being that he respected the role of Congress and the rule of law, and he provided the witnesses. Donald Trump did not provide the witnesses, and so the House cannot be faulted for not building the case because they were not given their due in terms of the witnesses.
Right.
And I think that's the greater, because think about it. We could argue all day about whether it's appropriate to withhold aid in order for this investigation to be done. But can you honestly argue and say the president should not have to provide witnesses when subpoenaed by Congress? Can anybody say that?
That's a good point. And if that becomes the new norm, then a president can do anything and just say, well, none of my people are going to talk to anybody about it.
Now, what I think the House should have done when those witnesses were told not to come, I think they should have issued, if it's a legal requirement for the witnesses to come when subpoenaed, they should have taken it to the next step and held them in contempt of Congress and had there be the legal battle on that. And it would have been a bloodbath. And it would have been brutal, but it would have brought this to the fore that this is the question. It's not just a question of why did Trump want this investigation. It's a question of, can Trump refuse to provide reasonable accommodation for the subpoenas?
Right.
The question of how much would be reasonable is another debate, but just completely stonewalling on that, I think, is and just saying this witness is not coming, period, I think that's the dangerous precedent that's set by this, more so than getting some political tit for tat or something like that.
Your point's better than my whole video.
And I hardly even prepared for this. Let's watch the rest of it. I'm sure there's some good stuff in there.
Wow. Dershowitz is now saying his comments were taken out of context. The fact is, he said what he said, and now he's trying to walk it back without walking it back. I strongly encourage people to watch his comments in full and judge for themselves. While he pays lip service to limits on abuse, he leaves room for no practical boundary. His comments are problematic for a couple of reasons. First, during the Clinton impeachment, Dershowitz acted for the prosecution and argued vehemently that no crime needs to be committed in order for an impeachment to move forward. Let's watch.
It certainly doesn't have to be a crime. If you have somebody who completely corrupts the office of president and who abuses trust.
Like, completely corrupts the office of president. Like, when he's being investigated for a bunch of other stuff, he lies about an affair that he had.
Right.
That's completely corrupting the office of president.
Right.
What was Bill Clinton actually impeached for?
2 charges: perjury and obstruction of justice.
Obstruction of Congress or justice?
Justice.
Justice. Okay. So the obstruction of justice by lying about Monica Lewinsky.
Right. And
he obstructed justice when the case and the impeachment was not about infidelity.
Right. It had nothing to do with that.
Now, granted, he lied to Congress, and that's a crime.
Yeah, he lied to Congress, but he willingly allowed himself to be deposed under oath.
Under oath.
Something that Trump would never allow.
That's true.
So if Bill Clinton had just said, guess what? I'm not going to testify under oath.
If he had refused to testify, they would have had nothing.
They would have had nothing.
But they still would have had obstruction of justice.
No, they didn't, because the obstruction was related to the perjury charge. Everything was related to him lying about them. Okay. So both charges just stem from the comment.
Oh, you're right.
Yeah.
But that's just his insincerity in his later comments are just, I think, I don't know. I can't think of strong enough words to say, like, not that like Dershowitz used to be my idol or something, but holy mackerel, guy. I mean, you just seriously have completely sold your soul in this comment.
Right.
You've shown that you're a lawyer, yet another lawyer with no soul or concern for justice.
Who could be bought for the prosecution or the defense or whoever's got the most money. Anyway, here we go. We'll watch that comment again here.
It certainly doesn't have to be a crime. If you have somebody who completely corrupts the office of president and who abuses trust and who poses great danger to our liberty, you don't need a technical crime.
But now he says that a crime must be committed. Here in the U.S., Lady Justice wears a blindfold, which represents impartiality, the ideal that justice should be applied without regard to wealth, power, or status. We cannot change our interpretation of the law based on who is being prosecuted. That isn't blind justice, it's blind partisanship. But let's put that aside and take him at his word that for the last 30 years that has been Dershowitz's belief, but as soon as he was hired by the defense team, he genuinely saw the light and realized the errors of his ways. Let's grant that. We still have the second problem, a bigger problem. The Senate refused to allow witnesses by concluding that withholding money to get Ukraine to announce they were investigating Biden is a legitimate use of power. If that is true, then there is almost no basis for a president to ever be impeached on the grounds of abuse of power. Some pundits claim a specific law needs to be cited and that abuse of power isn't a real thing. But the fact is that abuse of power is a real offense. It's part of common law and covers malfeasance in office and is what the founders of the country meant by saying that a president can be impeached for, quote, high crimes and misdemeanors. As an example, Governor Rod Blagojevich was impeached in 2009 for abuse of power while trying to sell the vacant Senate seat left behind when Obama became president. Although there was no specific law to cover this, it was more than clear this was an abuse of power. And there are plenty more historical examples. The reason why nearly all constitutional scholars, aside from Dershowitz, agree that impeachment doesn't require breaking the law is because these abuses of power can only be committed by the president, and so there are no specific laws on the books against them. Every possible abuse of power doesn't need to be spelled out in statute.
Okay.
In other words,
Yeah.
you can, by definition of impeachment, it's almost by the definition of impeachment that it does not have to be a crime.
Right.
Because if it did, then that would be, the president would be, by being impeached, he would be being indicted and held on trial for a crime, and the result would be removal from office and imprisonment.
Right.
Right? But there's never been the distinction that a president can only be impeached for an actual crime. What prior president has actually committed? Well, I guess Nixon had a crime committed with the breaking and entering and stuff, and Clinton committed a crime in lying to Congress.
But Nixon wasn't impeached.
Oh, right.
He resigned before the House could take a vote.
Sneaky.
Sneaky, tricky dick. But Andrew Johnson was impeached.
Right, but that wasn't for a crime, right? What did they claim he had done?
That's a good question. I you know what? I don't remember. He was considered like the worst president ever.
Yeah, I mean, it seemed to be, and I don't remember the exact thing either. But as I recall, it was more of a general feeling.
We'll
add
post
a
on the
link
bottom what the actual charge was for Andrew Johnson.
We'll fix this in post.
If we accept the absurd notion that anything the president does in the interest of his re-election is fair game, then we open ourselves to authoritarianism, a collapse of the rule of law, and a genuine corruption of democratic principles. If we accept that what Trump did was okay, then we must also accept that a president can withhold funds from every state until the governors of those states agree to publicly support the sitting president. This would just be considered another form of quid pro quo that would have to be considered legitimate according to Dershowitz. Or how about the idea that the president tells the Justice Department not to prosecute anyone that voted for him? This too is fair game under the rules.
No, I think that that's a little bit of a straw man, but I think a good example would be if the president said, if this investigation had to be done on his political opponents by every state, or else he would withhold, some type of federal funding, right? Not, in other words, that would be exactly what the Ukraine situation was, because with Ukraine, Congress had voted for funds to be provided, and he was withholding those funds in order for the investigation of his political rival. Why couldn't he do that with every state? That's not a straw man. That is exactly the same thing, only instead of Ukraine, it's a state.
Well, it wasn't just the break-in that Nixon was being impeached for, but if you remember, he was having his political rivals investigated by the FBI and by the IRS for tax fraud.
But he wasn't announcing them.
No, he wasn't. That's true. He wasn't.
Why wasn't he announcing them? Because he was actually
trying to dig up information. That's a good point. Okay.
Or how about selling Alaska back to Putin? There is no law against that at the moment. So would that be a valid exercise of presidential power?
But I think that's a little bit of a straw man. But no offense, because you usually avoid straw men. I've hurt your feelings.
I'm gonna do the
tears.
The tears.
The tears of a snowflake.
Yeah, there you go.
No one could possibly believe that any of these actions are legitimate, but that's exactly the road we're headed toward. There are conservative ideas to which I'm more than a little sympathetic, and ideas which I abhor. The most egregious are those that weaken the institutions of government and relegate our legislative bodies to the functional equivalents of guests on the Jerry Springer show. If Trump did what he is accused of doing, which we'll never know since the Senate decided not to call witnesses.
Well, mainly we'll never know because Trump refused to provide any witnesses to the House,
Right,
where the
right.
investigation was originally supposed to occur.
I could, I have to try to pack it up, but it's
No,
right. It's a two-headed thing.
Right.
House wasn't allowed to hear the
And the
witnesses they
Senate
wanted,
didn't see fit
and the
to
Senate
fix it.
didn't see fit
But
to
you know,
call
if
them.
the Senate had called the witnesses, he could have refused to provide witnesses to the Senate too.
Right, but the ones that they were most particularly interested in were like Bolton, who had just come out with the book, and these others
Oh,
who
okay.
were not in the West Wing.
Who
at
were
that
not
time.
in the West Wing.
Right.
Okay.
They still wouldn't have been able to hear from the West Wing witnesses.
Pardonable, regardless of his party affiliation.
Irrespective that the Senate failed to convict on the articles of impeachment, Dershowitz's transparently indefensible line of reasoning cannot be allowed to permeate the thought process of our nation's policymakers. If we allow this bastardization of conservative principles to guide our thinking, then we deserve the country that evolves as the byproduct of our decisions. But our children deserve better than a society run purely by self-interested partisanship and small-minded technocrats. So let's give them something better.
Because after all, the children are our future.
The children are our future. But my point stands. If you look at the baby boomers and the Gen Xers, which we're Gen Xers, our parents are boomers, as the kids call them these
Boomers,
days, the
yeah.
boomers. So the baby boomers, the Gen Xers, if we collectively together are unable or unwilling to set aside petty partisanship, right?
Right.
And if we're sending our country down the tubes simply because we can't stand to look at people across the aisle, then we deserve to be flushed down the toilet. That's
Well,
unrelated note, but I just thought I'd
solved-
mentioning.
solved another important issue for America. So you're welcome, America.
You're welcome, America. That's it for us. Oh, and next time we're going to be talking about, so no more Trump, no more impeachment for a while. Next time we're going to be talking about the Democratic field, particularly in Iowa and New Hampshire recently here, and the key as to why they can't seem to find a front runner, and more importantly, why it probably doesn't matter. Till next time, I'm Steve.
I'm Jeff.
So long.